来参加欧洲教育我们线上讲座的部分。大家都知道，如果想要出国念书或者是出国找工作的话呢，一个语言有官方认证的语言检测，甚至是语言测试考试结果是非常重要的，尤其是在你申请的阶段。那 Ielts 呢，就是大概就是全世界非常受欢迎，也是相信是很多人的选择之一。那究竟什么是 Ielts？ 那大家要怎么准备？那有没有什么准备的一些小秘诀，可以帮助我们拿到比较好的分数？今天我们很高兴呢，可以邀请英国文化协会的 Lisa 跟 Adam， 他们今天会为大家带来比较完整，然后比较的资讯，甚至是提供大家一些有关于甚至在口说方面大家比较关心的口说方面的一些考试技巧。那我们现在呢，就直接让我们的帮我们的简报交给 Lisa。
嗨，大家好，我是英国文化协会的 Lisa。好，那非常谢谢这次欧洲教育展的安排，让我们有这一次线上讲座的机会。稍微跟大家讲一下今天的讲座呢，前40分钟会有我这边稍微跟大家介绍一下雅思到底是什么，以及到底需要多少的分数，还有到底该怎么样做一个初步的准备，然后跟大家做一下介绍。还有当然我们英国文化协会除了提供考试之外，我们其实也有提供许多的备考的资源给大家，那这些大家都可以利用。那接下来的从7点40到8点20则会是由我们的外师 Adam 老师，他会跟大家针对口说部分该怎么样做加强训练，然后给大家一些小技巧。好，那我们就废话不多说，我们就开始咯。稍微跟大家讲一下，我们英国文化协会其实是有超过80年的语言测评的教学经验。那我们在全世界140个国家都有考试中心，那在台湾就是由我们这边来服务大家。好，其实说到雅思，大家都以为说一定是出国使用，但其实它的用途很多，像是毕业门槛，如果你是高中生，你是大学生，你需要毕业门槛，需要一个英文检定的话，你就可以来考雅思。那当然我们最大宗还是以留学居多，或是你想要参加交换生的一些 program 的话，其实你也可以拿雅思来作为英文检定的成绩。还有就是就业，通常我们这种英文检测呢，它的成绩只能保留2年。那大家会想说，那2年之后是不是就没有用了？因为2年呢是以国内外大学他们在做检测是以2年为基准，但是如果2年过了之后，我们还是建议大家把成绩单留下来，因为之后就业的时候，其实雇主不会那么坚持说一定要2年内的成绩才可以，甚至有些3到5年的公司行号啊，或者是政府机关，他们都是可以接受的。所以其实雅思它的功能很多，然后它的效用也很长。关于雅思，大家都会以为说就是一种考试，但其实是有6种考试。那大部分的人都会以学术组为主，也就是说要出国念书为主的。那其实大家有看到这边有雅思跟英国签证雅思，不知道有没有同学知道说2个的差别？其实从字面上可以先知道，一个叫做雅思，一个叫英国签证雅思。也就是说，如果你没有打算要去英国的话，你就单纯考一般雅思就可以了。但是如果你要去英国的话，你也不一定要去考英国签证雅思。为什么呢？大家可以看到荧幕上面有写的，如果你是要先去就读它的语言课程，像是 Pre-sessional courses， 也就是当你的英文程度还不到，没有办法直接上它的硕士班的课程的时候，你就要上一些语言课程，就要考 UKVI。那第2种呢，则是你想要去上他们的大学，那因为学制的不同，所以你会需要1年的基础课程，也就是 Foundation Year。你要去上这个 Foundation Year 的时候，你也是要考 UKVI。这样大家会想说 OK， 那雅思跟英国签证雅思它的内容啊，或是评分标准是不是都不一样？其实都是一样的哦，唯一的差别就是因为英国签证雅思它是要受政府所担保的，所以整个考试的过程呢，我们会用更严谨的态度去处理，也就是现场会有 CCTV， 会有侧录。那也因为我们有更严谨的安检，所以我们的费用会稍微高一点，一个是7200，一个是7820。那其他的所有的成绩单啊，或是难易程度啊、考题啊、评分标准都是一模一样的。 那 life skill 的话，只是针对要去做移民啊，或是配偶等等的，那这个我就不再多做赘述。好，针对雅思的话，很多人会有一个迷思，就想说雅思就是要去英国吧？但其实在全球140个国家都认证雅思，超过1万所的学校跟机构，当然有大家熟知的英国啊、澳洲、纽西兰这些一系体系，但是像美国、加拿大都很多学校都已经认证，像美国大家熟知的常春藤联盟啊、MIT 等等，全面采认。其实像是 MIT 甚至在他们自己的官网有写到说 IELTS is preferred at MIT， 也就是说其实更多的美国学校反而是比较喜欢采认雅思的。那这边大家都可以来做参考。好，因为台湾申请国外研究所比较多，那我这边先以申请英国研究所来做个例子。大家只要提供你的大学成绩，然后用作 GPA 换算，加上你的自传啊、推荐信或校外活动，再加一个雅思成绩，其实就可以做申请了。那如果你是要申请大学的话，那当然就是你高中成绩去做换算。然后还有第三个，则是如果你是要去念 MBA， 你可能还要再多考一个GMAT。所以其实申请英国研究所是非常方便的。好，那在这边也跟大家讲一下关于申请英国的学校。从2019年9月，英国政府就宣布，毕业后2年就会提供给学生2年的工作机会，也就是说你不用急着要赶快找到工作，因为像之前2017、2018年大概是4到6个月，其实是时间非常短。所以如果你是想要借由读书去国外工作的话，其实时程很短。但现在有这个好消息的话，其实就很鼓励大家，不管如果你是想要，其实目的是想要去国外工作的话，就可以好好利用这个机会。好，那我们这边英国文化协会其实也有提供雅思奖金，也就是奖学金的部分。那这个是我们今年的东亚区奖金的得主，那他是将要去美国的伊利诺伊大学香槟分校就读材料科学。这一位则是我们台湾区的雅思奖金得主的第1名，那他是要去念硕士，他是要去念室内设计，那将于明年1月的时候出发。我们每一年其实都会有提供这样类似的奖学金，然后大家可以看到，其实有去英国的，有去美国的，我们不会限制国家，只要那些你的学校，然后你想要去的国家，他们认可雅思就可以来做申请。那详细的资讯都会在我们的官网，那预计在今年的12月公布相关的申请资讯。那这边可以先跟大家讲一下，第一个，你一定要考我们的 British Council 雅思，然后每一科的成绩至少要6分以上。那第二个呢，会邀请你写一个500字的自传，那它会是以先线上申请的方式，然后我们审核过会有1到2轮的 interview， 那详细的资讯我都会在12月的时候公布。好，那这边跟大家介绍一下雅思考试，我们其实从2018年开始也有电脑考试。那最大的亮点，第一个就是3到5天就可以拿到成绩单啊，然后更多考期选择跟更充裕的报名时间。给大家稍微看一下，其实越来越多考生选择电脑考，第一个当然是因为他们可以很快拿到成绩单，那再来就是如果你平常是习惯用打字的，其实电脑考对你来说反而会得心应手，因为你可能很少在写字。然后考期呢，其实我们像台北场每个月差不多都是每天都在开这个考试，所以其实如果你想要很快拿到成绩单，然后你的 schedule 比较满的话，你就可以选择电脑考试。同样我们在台中、高雄也都各有考场，那陆陆续续会依着考生的需求在不同的城市做考场的开放。好，针对电脑考试，大家会有一些 top 10的迷思跟大家分享一下。第一个，电脑考跟纸笔考不一样嘛，其实评分标准跟题型都是一样的，单纯只是考试的deliver 的模式不一样而已。再来，电脑考可以做笔记吗？我们在考电脑考每个 section 都会提供给大家一个login sheet， 上面会有账号跟密码，那空白处就可以做笔记，不过每个 section 考完都会回收。听力考试会有最后10分钟吗？等一下会稍微提到说我们听力考试的题目是30分钟，那如果是纸笔考的话，你会有10分钟做誊写的时间，但是如果是电脑考试的话是不会有，你只会有最后2分钟检查时间。 每写一个答案需要 save 或 submit 吗？不需要，因为每个答案都会自动储存。大家可能以为电脑考就是在家考，不是，还是会要在我们英国文化协会所认证的电脑考场举行。再来是电脑考可以做标记吗？可以哦，你可以做 highlight 跟 taking notes， 还有 copy and paste 的一些功能。其实这对于打字很顺畅的同学来说是很方便的，尤其在写作方面。还有写作另外一个除了可以 copy paste 之外，它还有自动计算字数的功能，就不像纸笔的话，你可能要自己大概去抓一下自己写的字数够不够。好，再下来，电脑考会有自动校正功能吗？其实这个问题非常可爱，因为我们还是一个国际的考试，所以虽然那个版型看起来很像你在 Word 打字，但是它不会有自动校正的功能，你还是要完整的写好。考完可以提前离开吗？我们还是跟纸笔考一样，会统一时间开放，统一时间结束。那针对电脑考，其实跟纸笔考比较起来，比较不会那么拥挤，然后也有更多的考期供大家做选择。这边给大家看一下我们台北的电脑考场的样子，是全新装潢的，然后在我们的农会信义大楼，天天都可以考。而我们接下来也加开了雅思 UKBI 的电脑考夜猫场，也就是如果我们很贴心的为这些夜猫族就是增加了这些夜猫场，如果你觉得早起对你来说是一个很痛苦的事情的话，你可以来考我们的夜猫场。它会从笔试时间从下午开始，然后晚上的口试11到14分钟。那口试时间这边大家可能觉得很长，但基本上你会分配到11到14分钟，然后会有一个 time slot， 到时候会寄给你，所以不用担心说会要考那么长的时间。而最近呢，我们在做优惠，如果你报名雅思 UKBI 的话，我们将赠送给你 GEO Ielts Prep 备试课程组，那价值是台币2000块。那其实大家可以看到里面有很多帮助大家熟悉这个电脑考的一些模拟考啊，一些影片啊。那最重要是针对阅读跟听力有一些完整的回馈，大家可以做使用。那主要是针对在10月底前报名。那我们等一下也会讲到说，参加我们这个webinar， 我们还有特别的大礼包要送给大家。台中同样我们也提供了夜猫场给大家哦，然后有2个考试的场地。第一个是在台中嗨家教，然后第二个则是在台中自测会，可以供大家做选择。好，针对电脑考同学，我会再一次提醒，一定要上网看我们的电脑考题型范例，因为就像我刚才有提到说，电脑考有一些操作功能，如果你没有事前先看，其实会很可惜。有一些考生他没有先看一些这些 video， 然后使得实际上在作答觉得有点卡卡的。然后后来才知道，原来有 copy paste 有 highlight 功能都没有用到，就很可惜。那务必要在考前赶快把这些题型范例的影片都看一轮。好，雅思之路呢，也是我们另外一个线上学习教材。那同样的也是提供大家能够更多的互动练习。还有模拟考题，这也是针对雅思电脑考的。其中针对听跟读会给你一个完整的结果，是用 CFR欧洲语言架构的成绩来跟你做对应。好，针对不太熟悉雅思的同学，我们雅思呢就是听说读写，然后会给你每一个 section 一个分数，那分数从1分到9分。那当然如果越接近9分，就是你是越接近 native speaker， 然后最后还会有一个 overall 的成绩。给大家稍微看一下不同国家以及不同学校所需要要求的雅思成绩。这边呢是英国排名前20名的雅思成绩要求。基本上如果你要申请大学都会是 6.0 到 6.5， 那甚至有些比较好的学校可能要到7。那研究所呢几乎都是 6.5 分以上，那甚至当然如果更好的话，有些可能甚至到 7.5。这边要请同学注意，我这边列出来都是overall 的成绩。那有一些科系像是 medicine 啊或是法律啊这些比较专业的科系，他们可能会针对各个科目，可能是写作它可能需要7分以上等等，这边要请大家特别去各个科系做参考。那美国这边也是供大家做参看，同样大学也是 6.0 到 6.5， 然后研究所 6.5 分以上。因为近期蛮多人都会想去德国，因为 德国它的学费好像是免学费的嘛，那大家可以做参考，因为有些你毕竟还是会要上一些英语课程的话，他们的雅思要求成绩就不会像刚刚英语系国家那么高，那大学课程大概就是甚至有 5.5 就可以了，那研究所大概 6.0 以上你就可以了。同样的，再一次跟大家提醒，都要去看你们所要申请的学校科系他们所要求的雅思成绩。好，这边开始跟大家稍微做一下介绍。Listening 雅思 Listening 呢，刚刚有提到说是30分钟的题目加10分钟的誊写答案。那注意，刚刚有提到说电脑考没有10分钟的誊写时间，也就是说当你边听你就要学习边打，这个要多多练习。那有些同学会说，我还是习惯先写在空白处，然后再把它打上去，也没有问题，因为刚刚有提到说有空白处你是可以用 Login Sheet 的空白处把你的笔记写下去，但是会建议大家每个 section 听力的 section 结束之后就要赶快把答案打上去，以免你之后没有时间。那听力呢，当然只会播放一次，那会建议大家，如果你越可能错过了，你就没有办法再去听。所以说，因为我们这个考试它是不会倒扣的啦，不会像一些学校考试是会倒扣分数，所以如果你真的错过了，我会建议你还是尽量的去回答它。那这边有些 tips 给大家，拼写很重要，以及说有连字符号单词，因为很多的题目上面都会说请写出2个单词或请写出1个单词。那这地方就要注意说，譬如说如果有连字符号单词就会视为是1个字，那单复数啊、字数限制的都很重要。再来是 reading 的话，它总共有3大部分，然后40小题60分钟，也就是一题其实你大概只能用 1.5 分钟来去思考跟作答。这边会建议大家以精读跟略读的方式，也就是说你没有办法，因为它每一个篇文章都又臭又长啊，其实老实说，所以你不太可能每一个单字都去理解之后才开始作答。会建议大家先把题目看到说它要是问填空题还是选择题，然后再来回去找对应的题目的答案。那基本上它的顺序是会就是题目跟文章的顺序是会一致的，所以不用担心它会乱跳。只是因为它作答的方式会建议大家先把题目看完之后再来找答案会比较顺畅。而 writing 部分呢，则是有2大部分。第一大部分呢，只是图表题，那可能是有圆饼图啊、竖线图啊等等的，让大家来去做一个描述。那第二部分呢，只是针对一个议题，以你自身的经验或是意见来去做讨论跟分析。那同样的也是60分钟。那这部分的话，其实对于台湾学生来说，写作是比较难拿到分数的。那会建议大家依照以下这4个评分标准来去检测一下自己是否有达到，像是写作任务你这个有没有完成，然后连贯词啊、词汇丰富度以及文法多样性，这些都是考官在评分会依照这几个评分标准来做评分。所以当你写完的时候，你可以把这评分标准拿出来看，然后比对看说你哪一个部分还有所缺乏。最后一个部分呢，则是 speaking 的话有也是3个部分，然后总共会花11到14分钟。那会从简单到难，那其实我们的考试都是从简单到难。那一开始的话就会给你一些比较 relaxing 的比较 casual 的一些题目。那可能有些考生也是非常问的很可爱的问题，他会说一开始是不是考官就是想要让我们感到轻松，所以一开始的这种 small talk 应该不算分数吧？错，从你进到这个 speaking room 就开始算分咯。那大家还是要警戒一下，虽然不用太紧张，但是要知道说我们现在就开始考试。那一开始会给你一些比较轻松的话题，然后请你来做对答。那这边的话就会提醒大家，听不懂就要问。那这也是真人考官最棒的好处，就是说如果你真的连那个问题你真的好像没有听到、没有听懂，或是好像有就是闪神了一下，你不知道该如何回答的话，这边会建议你就是直接请考官再复述一遍。那第二个呢，只是简答还要延伸，这会针对一开始我刚刚有提到说就是 small talk 的这种 东西，也就是它的问题是非常简单，你也比较能够拿到分数。那你会尽量想要在你的词汇上能够更丰富，那大概回答3到4句就好，但是你会希望你的答案可以做延伸，而不是简答。那当然也是要善用准备时间，像后面的刚刚有提到说，接下来会是比较长的时间，你会给你1到2分钟，然后会让你去思考一个议题，那会给你一张笔记纸，你可以写一下一些重点，然后请你开始做阐述。其实说话也是跟写作一样，你需要去组织你的答案，才不会显得有点凌乱。那更多的技巧，我们等一下我们的 Adam 老师会跟大家分享。还有一个重点就是说，大家不要只 focus 在做练习题上面，而是要多涉猎不同的领域跟事物，不管是像是国际新闻啊、教育啊、媒体啊，甚至电影、小说等等的，因为雅思考的就是生活化的英文，也就是什么样的主题都有可能会是考题之一。甚至之前大家有在问说，我们最近因为这个疫情的关系，疫情会不会加入在考题里面？有可能哦，他可能不会讲说就是COVID-19 这么的直接，那他可能会说你对于传染病啊，你有什么看法啊？要怎么样防治等等的。这时候其实你就可以把你在新闻上面所看到的、所读到、所听到的讲出来，然后就会让考官其实知道说OK， 其实你了解蛮多，然后你的智慧也非常丰富。那这边给大家做参考。那当然就是 speaking 的话，当然是要多说多练啊。那我们会建议大家可以组一个读书会。那其实没有读书会，其实你也可以自己做练习，然后把它录下来，然后重复的去听说，你是不是有需要加强的部分？好，这边呢就给大家一些 tips， 就是说怎么样准备考试。当然会建议大家先设一个目标。如果说你打算明年出国念书的话，其实我会建议现在就应该报考试，因为当你报考试，你才有动力开始做准备。那当然是看每个人的英文程度，有些人可能2-3个月其实就可以考到他需要的雅思分数，那有些人可能需要半年，那你这边就要做思考了。好，这边给大家看一下我们雅思成绩单会长的样子，就像左边这样。那右边呢只是线上成绩预览。如果你是考纸笔的雅思的话，我们是14天就会公布成绩。那如果你是考电脑考，刚刚有提到3到5天成绩就会出来了。好，这边是我们线上报名系统的网站。那左下方是我们的 FB 粉丝团，有最新的推广活动消息啊，或是讲座啊等等的，都会立即的放在我们的粉丝团。所以如果你还没有加入我们粉丝团，现在就赶快加入吧。好。最后呢，再跟大家讲一下，我们除了提供考试之外，我们还有提供各式各样备考资源。除了刚刚有提到一些电脑考题型范例，我们有 Road to Ielts， 刚刚有讲到，我们还有出 App，Ielts Prep App， 里面有很多一些小题型啊，以及提醒你什么时候该准备啊，它会不断的跳出通知，所以如果大家有兴趣，其实可以把 Ielts Prep App 给下载下来。还有这个MOOC 免费的线上课程，我们1年大概会有3到4次，也是一些预录好的听说读写的影片，那都会做跟考生做通知，所以请大家现在就赶快加入我们的粉丝团，这样你就可以拿到第一手的资讯。那线下资源呢，其实我们也有出一本书是 Ielts 官方指南，那它在各大书局或是网络商城都可以买得到。那如果你还是想要一些面对面的课程的话，我们有另外一个单位是教学中心，他们在信义跟石牌都有分校，可以跟他们做咨询。那我们还在官网上面还有一份免费的练习考卷，大家可以做下载。好的，针对这一次参加我们的欧洲教育展，然后雅思的线上讲座，我们特别提供雅思备考大礼包。也就是说，从今天开始一直到10月31日前报名雅思或是 UKVI， 我们将送你这一个大礼包，有包含精美的 British Council Ielts 的水桶包，然后雅思练习题 16GB USB， 含一套模拟考题，有听说读写都有，以及免费雅思之路冲刺版线上练习题。这个冲刺版的线上练习题里面有2份，然后是以电脑操作，所以说如果你要考电脑考的话，其实是一个很棒的练习资源。那要报名的话，想要拿到这个大礼包的话， 请在报名的时候活动讯息栏位要填写 BCEEFT 2020，大家要记得填写哦，我们才会知道说你是从这个讲座过来的。第二个，再加码送大家，因为我们知道说其实台湾学生对于写作一直很难拿到高分，那针对这部分呢，我们特别加码，针对这一次来参加讲座的同学呢，同样10月底以前报名雅思或 UKVI 学术组的话，请写活动代码，然后我们就送大礼包，还针对你所写的雅思写作 Text 1提供写作建议。那题目呢，会有我们从我们的书Essential Guide 里面的例题中随机的做选取，然后寄给考生，然后我们的雅思专家将会为你做 Text 1的批改。那这边要注意，我们并不会提供成绩，而是提供给你一些写作建议，让你下一次在考试或是在自己练习的时候更有方向。那这个是很难得的机会，请大家要好好把握。还有呢，我们有一个免费的雅思体验课程，在11月16号晚上6点半开始到8点，那最多16人。左右下角这边有一个 QR code， 所以如果大家有兴趣的话，现在可以先拿起你的手机扫一下 QR code， 然后把你的资讯填写进去，我们的教学中心的业务他们将会用电话来通知跟你们做联系。其实我们等一下还会重复再跟大家讲这些优惠，所以如果现在没有扫到的也没有关系，等一下我们还会有机会。好，那这边也跟大家介绍一下我们的雅思课程，也就是我们刚刚有提到说教学中心他们提供的课程都是100%的国际型的外师，然后全英语文的环境，然后总共有60小题，针对高分技巧跟答题策略来提供给大家建议。所以如果有兴趣的，就赶快先扫刚刚的 QR code， 然后先去上这个体验课程，那有更多资讯可以跟我们的业务做联系。好，那我的部分差不多到这边，那我们的服务时间跟电话跟 email 都在这边可以看得到，如果有任何的问题都可以跟我们做联系，不管是写信或是打电话，甚至写讯息到我们的粉专，我们都会有专人来做回复。好，那我部分差不多到这里结束，接下来我把时间交给我们的成人英文教育长 Adam 来跟我们说如何使用技巧来拿到雅思口说高分。
All right. Good evening, everybody. I'm here to give you some tips on the Ielts speaking test. My name's Adam Malster. I'm the senior teacher for adults at the British Council in Taiwan. So hope I can give you lots of useful tips today. So basically this is what I'm going to talk about this evening. We're going to talk about the shape of the test and how the parts are different from each other and what that means for you, the candidate, what you need to change about your approach for each part of the test. We're going to look at part 1, part 2 and part 3. We're going to look at those in a little bit of detail, and we're going to have a look at some tips, and we're going to go through some model answers, and I'll give you some advice. And so we're going to finish off my little section by talking about tips for improving your speaking before the test, and then later Lisa's going to join me again and we've got time for your questions. Okay, before we begin all of that though, I'm going to ask you to do something very important. It's something I want you to do after this webinar when you have a chance. I want you to download some documents. I want you to download 3 documents, and you can do that by going to Google. I want you to Google this phrase, Ielts public band descriptors. Okay, that's all you have to write in, that's all you have to fill in. If you Google that phrase, it will bring up lots of different documents. You're looking for 3 documents. You're looking for the public band descriptors to help you with speaking and writing. There's 1 document for speaking and there's 2 documents for writing. So how will this help you? Well, basically, this is a guide to what the examiner is looking for at each band, so that you can give the examiner, you can do what the examiner is looking for, so that you can get awarded the band that you need. So if we look at this document here, we can see that it's broken into different criteria along the top of the document: fluency and coherence, lexical resource, grammatical range and accuracy, and pronunciation. So let's have a look at fluency and coherence. This is basically, can you keep talking and do you make sense? So let's have a look at band 7. Now band 7 says speaks at length without noticeable effort or loss of coherence. So this person, if they're going to get a 7, it means that they can keep talking and they usually make sense. If you look at band 6 though, it's a little bit different. Is willing to speak at length, though may lose coherence at times due to occasional repetition. So this person, they might not always be able to keep going, they might not always make sense, they might repeat themselves. So there's a clear difference between band 7 and band 6, and this document helps you understand the difference between all the different bands. So you can take your time, look at the document, you can try to think about where you think you are right now, and you can look at where you need to be. What's the band score that you need for whatever it is you need to do in the future? And that will help you understand how much you need to improve and what kinds of things you need to improve. So please do go and download those 3 documents. There are 2 for writing because there are 2 writing tasks. They're very, very important. They contain really good information. Let's move on and think about the speaking test, because that's what we're looking at this evening. So the shape of the test. It's really important that you understand what the test is going to be like before you arrive, because then you can prepare yourself for the 3 parts of the test. The test is going to take about 11 to 14 minutes. It's never going to be less than 11 minutes, and it will never be more than 14 minutes. It's going to be somewhere in between, because some people are not able to speak for 14 minutes. They may not be able to keep going, and the test might be a little bit shorter. In my experience, 90% of the time the test will be 14 minutes, because the examiner wants to hear you say as much as possible. If we go back to the band descriptors, you can see that the examiner has to make some very complicated decisions, right? There's a lot of information on this document. So that means that the examiner wants to hear you say as much as possible, and they're going to try and keep you speaking for 14 minutes. So how are the 3 different parts? How do they differ from each other? Well, part 1 is questions on familiar topics, okay? And you only need to give short answers here. If you're speaking for more than 30 seconds for each answer, it's probably too long at this part of the test. And this part of the test will last between 4 and 5 minutes. Part 2 is slightly different, and it's a little bit more difficult than part 1, because you're given a topic and you need to talk about it for between 1 and 2 minutes. In this part of the test, the examiner doesn't say anything, and so it's your responsibility to deal with all the talking. And so this lasts for between 3 and 4 minutes. In part 3 is the most difficult part of the test, and this is a 2-way discussion. You need to give longer answers here, and also you need to use some more difficult vocabulary, some more specific vocabulary. We'll look at that in a little bit more detail later in this webinar. Okay, that's going to last about 4 or 5 minutes. So you can see after 14 minutes, then that's the end of the test. All right. Okay, so let's go on and look at part 1 in a little bit more detail. So as I said earlier, Part 1 is questions on everyday topics. You might already be able to answer some of these kinds of questions, but you might need to do some more work on answering them in a bit more of an accurate way. Okay? So I think a good method for answering this kind of question, and a good way to make sure that you don't speak for too long, is this one here. Right? I think that you should answer the question. Usually that's a simple way to answer the question. And we'll look at that in more detail in a moment. I'll give you an example. And then I think you need to expand on your answer. You can expand by explaining why or how, or giving a few more details. And then you need to finish speaking, and you need to wait for the next question. It's very important that you finish speaking. What often happens is that people are very nervous during the test, and they just keep talking. And the problem with that is if you keep talking, that's when you don't know what to say next. And that's when you begin to think more about what you need to say next. You focus less on the language, and you're going to start to make mistakes, and you're probably going to be repeating yourself. Now, if you remember from what we were talking about earlier, that might limit you in terms of your score for fluency, right? You don't want to repeat yourself too much. So let's have a look at an example about how you could answer one of these questions. So here we've got a question for you. Let's talk about what you do. Do you work, or are you a student? Okay. So if we look at this answer here, this is a little bit short, but you could expand it. This answer's got the parts that I've just explained to you, right? So I'm a student at National Taiwan University. So that's a simple answer to the question, isn't it? That might not be the answer. It might be I work for a technology company. I develop software. It could be I'm a nurse. I work in a hospital. It could be any sort of answer to that question. All right. If we look at the next part of the answer, I chose it because it has a really good reputation. I feel lucky that I got in. So here we've got the person, they've answered the question, they're a student, and now they've just expanded that answer a little bit more. Okay, so what they've been able to do here is to show some nice accurate language, and they've given a good answer to that question, and they've had the confidence to stop speaking and wait for the next question. So you're going to get a few questions on one topic before the examiner moves on to a new topic. You can expect maybe 4 or 5 questions on the topic before the examiner moves on. So similar questions in this topic, asking about what you do, might be some of these kinds of questions. What are you studying? Why did you choose that course? What's the most difficult thing about your course? And what do you like most about your university? So you could use this same pattern to answer all of those questions in about 30 seconds, right? What are you studying? Okay, so you might say something like, well, I'm studying English language because I find English very, very interesting. All right, and I'd like to be a teacher in the future, right? The same with the next one. Why did you choose that course? Answer the question, maybe expand a little bit. So when you move on to another topic, when the examiner moves on, the examiner will tell you when you change topic, okay? So that you can get ready for the next topic. So the examiner will say something like, let's talk about computers now, right? And they'll ask you another quite simple question. For example, do you often use a computer? And again, you just need to use a similar structure to answer this kind of question. I use a computer every day. There's the answer to the question, but we've got the expansion as well. I need to use a laptop for university work. It's very useful for research, but also for dealing with email and messages. I also write essays with it. Okay? Now, for part one, you don't really need to use complicated vocabulary, right? These are straightforward questions. They're questions about your life, what you do, what your interests are, maybe who you know, who your friends are, your family, places you've been, stuff like that, right? But it's good to make sure that you have vocabulary that's specific to the topic, and maybe try some more idiomatic and colloquial language. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Well, again, let's have a look at an example. So how about this one? So maybe the examiner is going to say, we're going to talk about taking photos now, right? So everybody takes photos these days, right? Got my phone here. Everybody can take photos. So do you like to take phones? Do you like to take photos with your phone or a proper camera? All right. Okay. Well, I have a proper camera and it's awesome, right? I know it's unusual now that everyone has a decent camera on their phone, but I reckon you can get better pictures that way because I have more control over the exposure time. All right. So again, we're following that structure, aren't we, right? We've got an answer to the question, I have a proper camera and it's awesome, right? I like to use my proper camera. Okay. All right. Let's have a look at some of these words that I've highlighted. So we've got words like awesome, decent camera, I reckon. These are all more colloquial ways to use English. Maybe you've heard people say awesome quite a lot. Maybe decent is a bit more of an unusual adjective. You might not have heard that before, but it's definitely a way to talk about the quality of things that you own. Okay. If we look at that last phrase there, we've got exposure time. So that's not a very complicated piece of vocabulary, but it is specific to taking pictures. Okay, so that's why that's good language for you to use in the answer to this question. So in part one, they're quite straightforward questions, and you need to give shorter answers, answer the question, expand on what you're saying, try and use some language that's specific to the topic that you're talking about, and try and use some more colloquial, idiomatic language. All right. Part one is the part of the test where really, if you prepare, you can give some shorter answers, you can try and get some accurate language in, and you can start to calm down and feel a little bit less nervous, so you can get ready for the more challenging parts of the test. Let's move on and think about those parts of the test. Okay, so let's think about part two. So here's a part two question, for example. All right, and before we look at this question in detail, let's have a look at the format of the question. The important thing to know about the part two questions is that the format is always the same. Right, they always look like this. We'll look at this format in more detail in a moment. And they're always about something that ordinary people can talk about, right? There's never any trick question or something strange that you might not know about, right? They're never going to ask you a question such as, talk about the last time you went scuba diving. Okay, right? Because not everyone has been scuba diving. I've never been scuba diving. So you're not going to get something strange that you need to prepare for in that way. Okay? All right. They are going to ask you things that ordinary people can talk about. So this question, as you can see, is about a journey, right? And it's a journey that didn't go as planned. Now, that's pretty much, that I would say that's happened to everybody in their life. It might just be a short journey. It might be a journey that you took last week on your way to work and you were late for work. That's fine. That would work okay for this question. All right. Or it might be a more memorable journey. It might be something you did as part of your vacation and it was very memorable for some reason. That would be fine too. All right. So my question for you here is, how many things does a part two question ask you to talk about, right? Let's look at this question. Describe a journey that didn't go as planned. You should say, where you were going, how you were traveling, what went wrong, and explain what you would do differently next time. Okay? So how many things is that? That's where you were going, how you were traveling, what went wrong, and explain what you would do differently next time, right? So that's 4 different things, isn't it? So every part 2 question is going to ask you to talk about 4 different things to help you answer that question. Right? You're asked to talk about 4 things. Now, my advice is you should use the question to help you answer, right? So when you answer this question, you don't have to talk about those 4 things. As long as you talk about a journey, you don't have to talk about those 4 things. However, if you do talk about those 4 things, it's going to help you say as much as you can. It's going to help you develop the topic and give a logical answer. It's going to help you avoid repeating yourself. And importantly, it's going to take away some of the thinking for you. Right? If you don't have to think so much about what you're going to say next, you can focus more on the language and being accurate and using some good language that you know. Okay? So 4 things, right? You need to talk for 1 to 2 minutes. So how much time should you spend talking about each of those things? That's right, isn't it? You need to spend about 30 seconds talking about each of those things, yeah? Okay. So you'll get a piece of paper and you'll get a pencil and you'll be able to plan what you're going to say. So my advice is that you take that piece of paper and you divide it into 4, just as I've done here for you. That means that you can make notes on each of those things that you need to talk about. Now, you're going to try and talk about each of those things for about 30 seconds. In the test, you can't take your watch in, you can't use a clock. But at home, when you're preparing for this, you can definitely time yourself and you can start to get used to how long 30 seconds feels. And when you give your answer, in the test, you might speak a bit more quickly because you're going to be a bit nervous, right? But if you speak for 20 seconds, 25 seconds on each point, you're still going to be able to speak for long enough. It's still going to be between 1 and 2 minutes, and that's what you need, right? So we're going to make some notes to help us answer this question. A question that you should ask yourself is, what tenses do you think you will need when you're answering this question? I guess that most people that I'm speaking to this evening, their first language is Mandarin Chinese. And Mandarin uses very different methods to talk about time than English does, right? So in my experience, if you ask somebody a question in Taiwan, they'll usually give you an answer in present tense, okay? Sometimes that works, but often it doesn't, and you need different tenses, right? So look at this question. What tenses do you think you'll need? Well, let's have a look at the question. Where you were going, how you were traveling, what went wrong. So we've got a lot of past simple things to talk about. So you need to be answering using past simple tense, maybe present perfect tense, perhaps sometimes even past perfect tense. So it's a good habit to get into every time you see or hear a question in Ielts. Ask yourself, what tenses do you need? So that's really going to help you, especially if your first language is Mandarin Chinese. Also, is there any other grammar you need to be aware of? Get used to trying to think like that now, and when you get to the test, that's really going to help you out. So let's have a look at how we might plan. Use this piece of paper, use that 1 minute planning time very well. Okay. All right. So I'm going to make some notes. I've got where, I've got how I traveled, what went wrong, and what I would do differently next time. So when I make notes here, I'm not going to write full sentences. It's going to take up too much time. You'll notice here I've got how trav, right? I'm going to use keywords I'm going to make abbreviations, and abbreviations that make sense to me. So I've got next TM. Well, TM for me, that's time. That just makes sense for me. That makes it easy, right? Okay, let's add a few more notes to that, right? So where, CZ, right? So that's the Czech Republic. So I want to tell you about a time when I went to the Czech Republic. How did I travel? I went by train. What went wrong? I missed the stop, right? Got off at the wrong place. What would I do next time? Well, I'd definitely catch the plane instead of getting the train, all right? Let's look at a little bit more detail. I might add some more detailed notes there, right? So where was I going? I was going to the Czech Republic because it was my first job as an English teacher. I was going from London and I was traveling to a city called Zlín, right, which is in the eastern part of the Czech Republic. Again, I'm going to add some other notes here. Why did I go by train? Well, it was cheap and I don't like flying, right? You can see I've got this sad face to remind me that I don't like flying. Again, right, what went wrong? Well, why did I miss the stop? Well, it was a long journey. I had to go through Belgium and Germany. I fell asleep. There was a busy railway station. There were lots of soldiers getting on and off the train, and I got confused. What would I do next time? Well, I'd take the plane. Why would you take the plane? It's only 2 hours from London to Prague. That's a quick flight. It's comfortable. It's quick. Okay, so you can see one key thing to help me make these notes is this question here. Why? That's going to help me add information. Okay, that's really going to help me out. So for part 2, my advice for preparing for part 2 is practice lots of questions before you get to the test. Lots of different kinds of questions. There's loads of questions online. Just Google Ielts part 2, speaking part 2 questions. You'll find loads of them. And follow this method that I've outlined for you and repeat it as many times as possible. Time yourself answering. Get the feel for what 30 seconds is like, because that's really going to help you. Try and speak for the full 2 minutes, because that's going to help you give a really confident and detailed answer with lots of language in it. And try and bring that talk to a conclusion so it feels like it finishes naturally, right? It was the worst day of my life, or I'll never do that again. I really learned my lesson that time, all right? I'll give you some more tips when I finish talking about the next part of the test for how to prepare for part 2. Okay. Now, one thing I think that you should think about part 2, it's more challenging than part 1. I think you can see that. What I'd like you to think about here is the examiner doesn't do any speaking and it's your responsibility to do the speaking. So that can be quite intimidating. But think about it this way. This is where you are in control for 2 minutes. And if you do what you can do and you do it in the right way, you can control things and do things really well for 2 minutes. Produce some really good, impressive language. Okay? All right. Let's move on to talking about part 3. So the important thing about part 3, first of all, is to understand is that it's always connected by theme to part 2. Okay? So one thing to think about when you get that part 2 question, you might be thinking in the back of your mind, so what kind of questions am I going to get when I'm asked in part 3? Okay? So we got a question about a journey. So I'm thinking I'm going to get some questions about travel, that kind of thing, right? Okay? All right. The examiner's probably going to say something to you like, we've been talking about a journey that you made that didn't go as planned, and I'd like to ask you some more general questions related to this. Let's talk first of all about different methods of travel. All right? Okay. So, we might get a question like this, right? How do you think people will choose to travel in the future? So this is a question about different methods of travel, isn't it? Excuse me. All right, so I think right before we do anything else, if we look at this example question, I think immediately you can see you're going to need to use some more complicated vocabulary than those questions for part one, right? In part one, you might be asked to talk about what you like to do at the weekend, or what you like to watch on TV, or a place that you've been that was in the countryside, something like that, right? This is a little different, right? How do you think people will choose to travel in the future? So you're gonna need to use some different vocabulary, some more challenging grammar to answer this question. Another thing to understand about the part 3 questions is that there are a few different types of question, and each one asks you to do something different. So what you need to try and do is recognize the type of question that you're being asked, and once you recognize the type of question that's being asked, it's going to help you choose the right language to answer it. What do I mean? Let's see. Here we go. So let's look at this question. What are you being asked to do in this question? Or you're being asked to speculate on the future. You're being asked to talk about what you think is going to happen in the future. So that means you need to use specific language to help you with this type of answer. And I've got some of the language you might use here, right? So we might use will, and we might also use some other modal verbs like might to discuss the future. Depends on the degree of certainty we have, right? And we might also use some other phrases like almost certainly, and there are other modal verbs like could. We might use certain adverbs like probably, possibly, and then there's the more idiomatic expressions like never in a million years, right? Okay, so as soon as you use this kind of language, well, that's the kind of language the examiner is expecting you to use when you answer this question. Let's look at an example answer. Well, in the near future, I think we will almost certainly see more people buying electric cars and scooters. You can already see a lot of them on the road in my country. This is because the Earth is running low on supplies of fossil fuels, such as petroleum. So we're going to have to rely on power generated in other ways. It's bound to be a good development though, because it will potentially lead to our cities becoming cleaner places. All right, so you can see that I've highlighted in red that language that's going to help you talk about the future. Okay, so it's important when you're preparing for part 3 to know what kind of language you need for each type of question. So if we're talking about the future, we've got this kind of language here, and a lot of this is just different ways, more interesting ways than just using will and a verb. Okay, so I won't go through all of those in detail right now, but you can see there's lots of different ways to talk about the future, and that's what you should be reviewing in preparation for the test. So apart from talking about the future, you can expect to be asked these types of questions too, right? You might be asked to give your opinion on something. You might be asked to evaluate something, right? What do you think about somebody else's opinion? You might be asked to talk about causes and effects. You might be asked to talk about an imaginary situation, a hypothetical situation. Might be asked to talk about the similarities and the differences between two things, compare and contrast. And you might also be asked to talk about how things were different in the past and how they've changed. You might be asked to talk about the past. So each of these question types requires specific language that you should review and get ready for before you go to the test. I'm going to run through some of these different kinds of language. I'm not going to go in detail, but just to highlight for you the kinds of areas of language that you need to get ready for so you can answer this question, these kinds of questions accurately. Okay. So if you're talking about your opinion, there are different ways, more interesting ways to think of saying I think or in my opinion, right? We've got some here. As I see it personally, if you feel really strongly about something, there's definite language for you to use. Or if you're less sure, there's some language for you to use. So, for example, at what age should children be allowed to use their own cell phone, be allowed to have their own cell phone, okay? All right, well I'm convinced that children should not have cell phones. They're not old enough to use social media correctly, and there are certain dangers with giving young people access to online environments when they're on their own, okay? All right, so that's one way I might answer the question. Again, there are other examples there of opinion questions, okay? And I can use a lot of that language. I guess that, I suppose that, right? Are we becoming too reliant on technology? I suppose that we might be. Often I use Google when I can't remember something, and I worry about that because I definitely didn't behave like that 20 years ago. You might be asked to evaluate someone's opinion, right? So we've got some expressions here to help us do that. Some examples, right? Many people say technology makes people speak to each other less nowadays. What do you think about that? Oh, I totally disagree. I couldn't disagree more with that. You know, people can talk to each other more than ever before. It's very difficult at the moment to speak to my mother back in England. I can't travel to see her, especially in the current situation in the world, but I can definitely WhatsApp her every week, and that's really, really easy to do. You might be asked to talk about cause and effect. We've got some language here to help you with that. Right, so how does advertising influence what people choose to buy? Okay, so I might say something like, well, as a consequence of advertising being on TV all the time, we often feel the desire to own more expensive possessions because we're constantly being shown expensive cars, for example. You might be asked to talk about a hypothetical situation. Key piece of grammar here is to make sure that you know the second conditional in English, because that's how we normally talk about things that are possibilities in the future, right? So there's a lesson here on our teens website that can help with that. Okay. If the voting age were reduced to 16, what would be the consequences? Well, I think that young people would feel more empowered, and perhaps they would feel more engaged with the political process. On the other hand, if young people were able to vote, perhaps they wouldn't always make the most wise decisions because they haven't had the life experience that older people have had yet. And again, with compare and contrast, comparatives is a key grammar area. And on our website, again, the British Council Learn English website, here's a lesson that can help with that, comparatives and superlatives. Okay. So do you think that children should have a social media presence or wait till they are adults? Well, I think that children often don't have as good judgment as adults and are not as disciplined with their time. So perhaps we should be very careful about allowing them to have a social media presence. And again, with the past, right? So to talk about the past and compare it to the present, then we really need to know about our verb tenses. We need to review present tenses, past tenses. Used to is a good structure, and also would and an infinitive to talk about past habits, right? So when I was a boy, I would often watch a black and white TV in my bedroom because it was the 1980s. That's how old I am, all right? Okay. So, thank you for listening to me give you some tips on the IELTS speaking test. Overall, I want you to bear in mind these things, okay? Download the public band descriptors. For part 1, I want you to try and relax. I want you to try and make straightforward and confident answers. Remember, don't talk for too long. For part 2, take control. Use the question to help you. For part 3, use appropriate language for the question. Start preparing now. What is that appropriate language? And another bonus tip from me, begin recording yourself speaking English, because that can help you get used to your English speaking voice. But it also means that you can start analyzing any mistakes that you can hear yourself making. It's a really, really powerful thing to do. Now, if you'd like to learn more about the courses that we've got at the British Council that can help you with IELTS, then on the 16th of November, you can come and have a lesson with me. I'm going to be doing a demonstration lesson, and we're going to be looking at speaking and listening in that. And that'll give you a really good idea of the approach that we take when we teach our IELTS courses at the British Council. Okay. Right now, I'm going to ask Lisa to come back, and we're available for your questions, and we're going to give you some more information. Okay? I'll take a drink of water.
Okay. Yeah. So
I believe Adam had given us really specific phrases and examples on how to prepare for your task. Now we will start taking questions from the audience. You can leave your question in the question function on your webinar control panel. So as we all know, like there will be four parts of ability, English ability will be assets, which is our reading, listening, speaking, and writing. And based on your experience, what are those like wicked hard for say students in Taiwan, and how they can improve or prepare themselves for each part of the assessment? Can you give us some suggestions for each of them?
Yeah. Okay. So I would say that Taiwan is similar in some ways to almost every country in the world, in that writing is probably the most challenging skill for most people. That makes a lot of sense, right? Because very few of us actually enjoy writing even in our own language, right? If I gave you the choice between writing 400 words for me or just speaking to me for 10 minutes, you'd probably take the second one of those two, right? Okay. Yeah. Whether it was English or Chinese, that's probably what you'd take, right? Because writing's more difficult. So I think the important thing is getting to know the task types. Okay. So the important thing is getting to know what you need to do to answer in task 1 and task 2, because they're different. Task 1, I don't want to go into too much detail here because we're talking about speaking, but task 1 is very much more about describing data, and task 2 is very much more about giving your opinion. So there are specific structures to answering that kind of question, right? So for example, in task 1, you're often given a graph to describe. So a good way to answer that question is to answer it with a general statement about what the data shows you, and then to go into more detail. And then when you go into more detail, that's when you're going to really need the language to help you describe changes in data, changes in figures, changes in numbers, that kind of thing. For task 2, it's much more maybe writing about 4 paragraphs and giving your opinion and making sure you have logical paragraph structure in English with a topic sentence and supporting sentences. And then it's really about trying to do as many questions as you can. One good method I think that people should try is get yourself a model answer to a question, okay? So get yourself a question with a model answer. You can find those online. Before you read the answer, write your own answer to the question, okay? Then take a break, and then after that, go and read the model answer. When you read the model answer, make 2 lists of vocabulary. One list of vocabulary should be words that you read that you can use in any essay that you write. And then the second list should be words that are specific to that kind of question, that topic, right? So for example, if you were asked to talk about pollution, the specific words might be combustion, transport, diesel engines, that kind of specific stuff. And then maybe take another break, then answer the question again, but this time have the vocabulary lists in front of you and just answer the question again. And then that gives you a chance to use that new vocabulary, but in your own way. And then compare your first answer to the second answer. The second answer should be a higher quality answer. And so what you've used is a more experienced writer's writing to improve your own writing, but you haven't copied, you've just used some of that language to help you. Okay, so that's a practical tip that I think you can use with task 1 or task 2.
然后这边做一下补充，因为其实我们每年都会有记录说，像是整个东亚区，平均每个学生，应该说每个国家的学生他们的雅思成绩，然后其实就像 Adam 老师所说，整个东亚区下来最低分的都是写作，那写作上面其实对亚洲的学生来说是比较难得到高分的啦。那除了刚刚老师讲到的 tips 之外，刚刚提到就是如果报名我们的考试，我们会再加送你一个 Text 1的批改，所以可以给你们一些方向，说应该要怎么样去做精进。
Thank you. For those who take IELTS on computer, for their speaking task, do they also talk to the real person, or is it an alternative way to take the task? 电脑考试的部分，口说也是会跟真人考官对答吗？还是说会是有不一样的方式？
我们基本上都是以真人回答的方式，就是说面对面的方式。那因为近期可能有1-2场啊，接下来我们会有是说以视讯的方式，但视讯的方式你还是以跟真人面对面。那所以其实大家不用太担心说是不是会变成说跟其他的电脑考试一样，可能单纯只是机器。那这部分的话我们还是会维持真人，因为毕竟这是我们的雅思的最大的卖点，我们就还是以真人的面对面的形式。那看 Adam 要不要再补充 ？Do you want to add something?
Can you ask the question again?
So if they choose take the task on the computer, will they talk to for the speaking task? Will they still talk to the person, or will they talk to just the machine? Is it in a different way if they take the task in a different way?
Well, I think no, you're going to be talking to a person. Yeah.
Yeah, for speaking task part, it's always the same. Like you have to talk to a real person, either it's through the software online or it's face-to-face test.
Yeah. So speaking test is the same.
So they won't just talk to the machine or just the computer and be recorded for that?
No.
I think one of the methods to prepare for the task is to improve their vocabulary, right? So some students may be very good at memorize a lot of vocabulary, but they don't know how to really put that into the article, in the writing or speaking. What would you suggest them to practice with when they are learning new vocabulary?
Okay, are we talking about writing or speaking here?
Both of them, like in general.
Okay. All right, so the key thing about learning new vocabulary is being able to use it in context. Okay. Firstly, it's probably a waste of time to just try and memorize lots of words. Also, it makes it really more difficult to remember those words. So what you need to be doing as much as possible is obviously doing as much writing practice as you can. But a really good way to acquire vocabulary and use it in context is not just to keep writing, but it's also to use it in conversation with other people. Okay, so what I recommend is that you, if you go to the British Council website, there's a lot of articles for you to read. There's a lot of lessons to do, articles to read, things to listen to. And you can do those lessons and you can make notes of new vocabulary that you want to try out. Now, the important thing is that you take those notes and you go and talk to somebody else about what you learned. So grab a friend who can speak a bit of English. Often they might not want to do this with you, so maybe you want to buy them a coffee or a cake or something like that, right? Be nice to them. They're giving you your time, giving you their time, and just say something like, "I did this lesson on the British Council website. Can I talk to you about what was in that lesson, what I learned?" And you can use the notes that you made with the new words to help you. And then when you talk to them about what you learned, you're going to be using those words in context. And that's going to help you when you need to go to the speaking test, but it's also going to help you in your writing because you're going to be able to remember them better and you're going to be able to use them in a more natural way too. So one of the mistakes that people often make is they only study alone and they just try and memorize things without using them. As soon as you learn a new word, as soon as you use it, then actually it becomes your word. So 我学中文的时候，如果我学新的字， if I use it immediately, it's no longer a Mandarin word for me. It's actually my word. It's my phrase. As much as it is anybody else's, it's a part of me now because I've used it and I've learned whether I'm using it in the correct way, right?
Yeah, one of the go ahead.
Sorry. 补充一下，因为刚刚那个问题就是关于那个前一个问题啊，关于口说方面，可能大家以为说电脑考试，我们跟大家讲一下，就是电脑考试主要只有听读写是用电脑操作，口说跟纸笔考试一模一样的，都是以真人的面试这样子。
So yeah, regarding like most students might be say how they learn, it's the way they learn the vocabulary. For example, they may just check the Chinese translation in dictionary, or they just memorize them. But most of the time, they don't know which context they should use the words, right? Because in Chinese, it's very general, like it could be everything. So I would say just probably study the word or learn the word from a sentence or from an article or from the short phrase be better than just memorize the meaning of the word.
I think it's important to maximize your exposure to the language as much as possible. you have to do as much reading and as much listening as you possibly can. I know that's difficult. I know it's time consuming, but IELTS is something important for you in your life. So it's something that you have to do. And it's also a good habit to get into, because I would guess that if you're in the stage of your life where you're doing the IELTS test, English is part of you, who you are. It's part of your life. It's always going to be important to you. 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now, when you're very, very old, it's still going to be an important part of your life. So it's a good habit to get into. The more you expose yourself to the way English is written, the way it sounds, it's going to help you to use it more naturally.
For speaking part, is there any practical method that could help students to be more, say, fluent and clear when they try to express themselves?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I talked earlier about recording yourself. I think it's really important to do that. Let me be honest, it's not pleasant. Okay. And again, I've done this when trying to learn Chinese, and I don't like listening to myself speaking Chinese. Because let's face it, for me, that guy speaking Chinese is not as smart and funny as I am, right? It's just the way it is. But it is very useful, and if we want to develop, often we have to put up with some kind of discomfort, don't we, right? Now, if you want to improve your fluency, if you record yourself, so let's say, for example, you get a task speaking part 2 question. So you record your answer and you listen back to it. Now, if you're that kind of band 6 person who doesn't, and sometimes they don't make sense all the time. If you're that kind of person in English, okay. So when that happens, when you're listening back to yourself, that's when you press stop on the recording, and this is when you've got to make some notes about your performance, because you're examining yourself and your own performance. This is going to help you to become more independent, right? So the notes that you make when you've pressed stop is, well, what is the thing that is stopping me being fluent right now? What is it? Right, because it's not the same every time. Speaking is incredibly complicated. We think it's easy because our brains fool us in our own language. Our brains make it seem easy. It's not, is it? There are many things going on at the same time. So, for example, it could be the grammar, right? It could be you're not completely sure about this grammar point. You kind of know it, but you don't. It's just not close enough, right? So, okay, make a note of that. It might be vocabulary. It might not even be that you don't know the word. It might be that you know 3 words and you don't know which is the right one, right? Okay. It might be the pronunciation. It might be a whole host of different problems. Once you have finished listening to yourself, you've got a list of things to work on there. A list of things to maybe go and ask your teacher about, go online and read about, go back to your grammar book, go and ask your friend about, then try the answer again. And you will have worked on those things. So the next time you try it, you can answer that question a bit more quickly and a bit more fluently. And then step by step, that's going to help you get those ideas from your head and into English as quickly as possible so that the other person can understand you.
And anything from Lisa?
其实就像刚刚老师有提到，然后我其实之前有讲到，基本上就是你要多练习，然后其实真的是多听自己讲的，会比较知道说自己的缺点在哪里。其实我觉得就像我们在讲中文，老实说，有时候讲中文，我们有时候你真的要做一个演讲的时候，你头脑还是会思考，因为有些字你平常不太会讲嘛，那你平常比较轻松的那些话，那当你要正式在做一个演讲的时候，你有时候还是会思考，那更不用说英文是我们的第2语言嘛，就是并不是我们的母语，我们更不熟悉它。 那其实就像刚刚 Adam 老师说的，当你针对特定的字词，你多练习几次之后，然后当你犯错，然后你知道你那个地方有错，那当你多练几次，下一次你再听到，你那个字句会自然而然的就讲出来的，而不会需要再经过思考，因为你已经很习惯那个地方就是要这样讲了。然后还有另外就是，如果刚开始初期你真的觉得太无聊的话，我真的还是建议可以组个读书会啦，就是跟一群人聊天还是比较有趣啦。然后其实也可以听听对方的回答，然后可能或许他们会讲到一些你没有想过的一些内容等等，因为每个人看事情的角度都不一样嘛，那其实也会让你的回复会比较丰富一点。
I think for sounding natural, again, the more English you listen to, that's going to help you. You can also, if you go to the British Council website, all the listenings have transcripts, so that you can read the transcript out and you can record yourself reading those words and then compare yourself to what you hear. Have you got a similar rhythm? Are you emphasizing similar words? Are you intonating in the same way? Are you stressing the similar things? How does it sound when you listen back? How does it compare?
像可能就老师说的一样，就是同学们可以就是你可以针对不同的题目想想你会怎么回答。那想必你针对每个题目，你可能比较弱的地方，或是会让你卡住的地方都不太一样。它可能是你不太有什么想法，或者是你不知道用什么字汇，或者说你的文法你想不出来那样，你会有点不太清楚你要用什么。那当然是针对你每一次这样的问题，多累积几次练习之后，你会知道自己自己比较需要加强的地方，那可以针对这方面再多做练习。我们因为时间关系，就是现在最后一个问题 ，Let's have the last question. So we have, since we have like listening, speaking parts, and then student might be aware, they might have a concern about the accent. Either it's for video or it's for the examiner. So they practice on this part, and what are those results they might make use of?
You mean so that they're used to listening to different accents?
Like British accent, Australian accent, etc.
Okay, so the first thing that I would say is that, okay, so I think it's important that in the test they do hear different accents, because people use English in different parts of the world. So that's something that you just need to get ready for. If I really want to improve my Chinese, I've got to be aware that there are different places where people speak Chinese and they use it in slightly different ways. So I think that a really good thing is, again, to just try and expose yourself to as many different accents as you can by listening to as many different things as you can, right? So, and it's not difficult to do. If you can listen to lots of Americans on cable TV, right, on the news channels, online, you can listen to lots of British media, you can Australians, Irish, South Africans, they're all around, and you can listen to people talking about many different things. And it doesn't just have to be the news, right? It doesn't have to just be cable news. If you go on YouTube, it could be just something that you're interested in, and there happens to be somebody from New Zealand who's talking about that thing, so that you can get used to those different accents. And mostly what I would bear in mind is that for most, the differences between most accents in English is about the vowel sounds. The consonants are going to remain the same. It's mostly the vowel sounds. So it's just about exposing yourself to as many different kinds of English as you can, and that's never been easier than it is as it is today.
然后补充一下，因为像我们的 speaking， 我们考官啊， 他们来自不同国家，有美国、有英国、有澳洲，甚至南非，只要他们的母语是英文的，都有可能会成为我们考官。所以其实就像刚刚老师说的，就请大家就是要让自己接触各种不同的口音。尤其因为台湾我们主要是学美式为主嘛，那可能对英式英文有一点不太熟悉。那其实最近我们刚好 British Council 跟 XN 有合作，那他们有出了一系列的英式电影跟影集，所以如果大家有兴趣可以去上面看。然后在我们的官网我们也有教一些typical 的 British 用法，大家都可以做参考。
I think the thing is that, okay, so Ielts is an international English language testing system. So it's about English for international use, right? And I think it's just a fact of life that in professional situations, English speakers, in professional international situations, English speakers will moderate their language a little bit, right? So that, you know, if I'm at home with my friends, if I'm back in the UK with friends having a drink in a bar, I don't really sound exactly the same as this right now, right? Now, I'm not making my English simpler for this. I'm just maybe approaching a bit more of an international standard, okay? Because there are very few people who are going to understand some of the things that I would say back home to my mother or my friends or something. Right, so in the speaking test, I don't think it's something that you need to be overly concerned with.
所以基本上我们考试老师还是应该说考官他们还是会讲很清楚的英文啊，对啊，所以不用太担心这些口音的部分，可以稍微去熟悉，但是不用太在意。
And the examiners want you to say as much as you can, right? So they're going to want to be as clear as they can. Because they want you to say as much as you can as well, right?
然后真人的好处就是，如果你真的听不懂，你可以请考官再 repeat 一次，这样子，对不对？
今天谢谢两位，就是为我们带来这么就是详尽的介绍，跟真的是 step by step 的教学了，就是非常的实用。就是最后请丽塔，我们再跟我们同学讲一下，就是有关于报考雅思这方面的优惠呢。
好，最后再提醒一下，到10月31，也就是10月底以前报考雅思或 UKBI， 我们会送这个大礼包，有包含水桶包，然后 USB 里面有一套模拟考题，以及雅思之路冲刺版，然后里面有2套的电脑考题。那请大家务必记得在活动讯息栏位要填写 BCEFT 2020，也就是说代表说你有参加这一场讲座。然后呢，还有送大家一次雅思的写作 Text 1的批改。那这个的话，其实是每个学生都很想要的这种写作的建议，所以请大家要务必好好的利用这次的机会哦。然后最后则是雅思的体验课程，11月16号礼拜一6点半到8点。其实我刚刚另外有想到，大家如果对于 speaking 啊，觉得想要找战友们一起来准备，就可以来参加这体验课程，因为大家来参加的都是对于雅思有兴趣的，所以其实你在这个课程不但可以听到老师针对雅思更多的详解之外，你也可以去找你的战友们。
非常谢谢，就是刚好可能也许当天大家就可以组个读书会，也不一定。
对，没错。
可以一起互相鼓励，互相一起练习这样。那我们今天关于雅思准备以及技巧的解说这边到告一个段落。非常谢谢 Lisa 跟 Adam 今天参与我们的讲座，然后带来这么详细的解说跟简报。然后相信对同学在准备方面呢，或者说你本来不是很清楚这个考试在做什么，或者是你要怎么准备，你的方向也许会比较确定了一点。大家如果都还有问题的话，其实在 British Council 的网站上都有非常详尽的资讯，然后大家都可以去参考。如果有问题的话，上面都有联络的资讯，你们可以做进一步的咨询。那今天晚上很谢谢大家的参与，我们下个礼拜再见。
谢谢，拜拜。
拜拜。